Welcome back to the Change MakerZ podcast. My name is Madie Hricik, and this week we are going to be discussing equities within the male-dominated workplace, particularly female equity, and I am joined by WHSV's sports reporter, Peri. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a blast for me to come back to JMU here. I mean, this is a lovely campus, lovely people, so happy to be here.
Yes, and I know both of us are very much involved in the sports media world, both of us taking on different roles. I know I normally kind of stay a little bit more on the print side while you're doing a lot more of that multimedia journalism, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your background because you were a college student athlete. And so what parts of you being a college student athlete kind of translated into wanting to go into sports media?
I mean, it was the competition. It was the life of being a competitive athlete every single weekend, and that build up during the week, that daily grind of practice, that's what gives me life. And so then when it came time to graduate and to look into the real world, I knew I wanted to keep on performing and keep on competing. And the closest place to that was broadcasting for me because, as you know, Madie, the daily grind of broadcasting, I mean, we are waking up early, we are going to bed extremely late, sometimes not going to bed, but it is that daily grind and that progress that we're seeing as we evolve as reporters.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that makes being a woman in a male-dominated field like sports media so difficult is that grind, is that there is a level of work ethic that's required, not just for any sports journalist, but it almost feels like there's a specific involvement for women in sports media. How do you balance kind of that grind to get yourself motivated, but also knowing that, you know, sometimes you might have to put forth that extra visible effort to be able to show what you're able to do and kind of be seen in this world?
I love that question, but I'm going to flip it and I'm going to say that we actually have an advantage, and we have an advantage because we can surprise people as women. Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes when we walk into spaces, Madie, it's just you and I. We're the only women in these spaces, and I feel like we have the chance to ask a question that maybe people don't expect. We have the chance to look at the emotional side of sport because as women, we are sometimes a little bit more in tune to those emotional changes within an athlete, and especially being a former athlete, as you as well, we're able to see and feel those questions. And I feel like in a lot of ways we have a different perspective. And so I like how you asked how we can live with it, but it's almost a way that we can take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about sometimes being the only female in a room when you're going to a press conference. I know you and I have experienced this in our own ways, but you know, has that ever intimidated you at any point in your career?
Of course. I would lie if I say it hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is an empowering moment. And I feel like we as women choose to either use that to strengthen us or use it to weaken us. And for me, it's always been a strength because I love to be different. I love to stand out. And that's how it's always been for me. I mean, I'm a 5'4" redhead girl in a room usually full of middle-aged men. And that's how we operate. And I feel like that's a fun space to be in. And it's also a space of a lot of growth because we just want to see more and more women. I mean, for me, it's so important for me to see more women in that room, but we have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at how this landscape is developing, there's so many more women that are coming out, and there are organizations that are being created to help support women that not only are all female based, but also have male allies. You know, what's that mean to be able to see groups of women coming together and, you know, having these male allies that support our journey and our involvement in this industry?
It means everything because it's what I wish that I had in college. And you know what? I did have a little bit of it, but a lot of it was self-made. And a lot of it was me reaching out to other women in the industry, not necessarily through an organization, but now I'm seeing all these organizations pop up. And I both love to see that, but also I love to see the women that are involved in it because there's so much involvement from the mentor side. So the mentors are actually helping up the next generation of women. And I just want to be a part of that in any way that I can.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about finding people that you can have as a mentor and wanting to be a mentor yourself. Was there anybody that kind of helped guide you along your way throughout your early journey?
The first woman to do it all, and to do it all in a historic way, was Leslie Visser. Mm-hmm. And she's been an incredible mentor, both as a person, but also in the industry. And I feel like looking up to her and reading her book, sometimes you have to cross when it says don't walk, and that's one of my favorite books in the history of books, but also in the history of women's sports, because Leslie Visser has been a woman that's really implemented the concept of being the first and being okay with being the first, and also being so good that you're undeniable as the first. And that's a word that's always in my head, to be undeniable as a woman in sports.
And to tell me a little bit more about what you want to grow into as a journalist. I know a lot of times when you're working in a college market like in Harrisonburg, where you have 2 Division III schools, a plethora of high school sports throughout Rockingham County, and you have an FBS Division I program kind of taking a lot of that reins. It's a very vast and a very diverse market, but how do you kind of navigate that in your own way?
I want to be the first but not the last in what I do, and so women's sports only get 4% of media coverage. So moving here to the Valley, my goal was to make it more, 4.1, 4.2%. Just give these women that work so hard at every level of sport, give them a platform to share that experience. And I feel like there wasn't really a live community of female athletes in the Valley, and so I aim to create that in my Women in Sports series now. We're over 20 episodes in of highlighting women at all levels of sports. So not just the current female athletes, but the female athletic directors, and perhaps, even the women who run tournaments in the area. So I feel like there are so many women that go into making sports in the Valley so special, and that's what I want to both be a part of on the media side, but also just give them a space to all come together.
And you talk about this series that you've created. Tell me a little bit more about that, and tell me, what are some of the feedback that you've gotten from both male viewers and female viewers that have watched your series?
They didn't know that these women existed. They didn't know that these women were doing this thing. And for me, the greatest joy in this industry is telling stories. And it's telling stories through the women's lens and through being a female athlete and understanding the nuances of both being that athlete, being the competitive athlete, but also the transition period, that gritty time when we're just a few years out of college, when we're trying to make it, when we're trying to find our way and find ourselves in the sports media world. And so for me, that's obviously been broadcasting, but for a lot of other women that are moving on from competitive sports, it means something else. And so if women are staying on the court, great, but if they're moving off the playing field, off the courts, I want to know, what's that like for you? Because we often see the women that have made it, but what goes into that? Those first few gritty years, Madie, you're about to enter that space. There's not really a live community of people that are talking about that. So that's a lot of what I aim to do in this series, and that's a lot of the feedback that I've gotten, is that people thank me for talking about that time when things aren't so perfect and things aren't so pretty, and we are finding ourselves.
And looking at beyond just the sports media industry, but you look at so many different females trying to make their way in male-dominated industries. It's really become something that has become a topic of conversation, particularly in Gen Z, which is part of the reason why I wanted to really dive into this topic with you on this podcast. When you look at all of the different industries where women are starting to step up, they're starting to make their presence known, whether it's through advocacy groups, whether it's through actually going in and taking on higher ranking roles. What is that like to be able to see that develop? I know when you're a little bit younger, you don't see that, so you're kind of growing up with it, and you're entering your work life with this change kind of really starting to come forward.
It's wonderful to see. It's wonderful to see people coming together and people understanding that we need diversity in the workplace, in sports media specifically, because if we have female voices, we're going to be highlighting female athletes. And that's just something that was never a given in sports media. And so it's part of my goal to both see that through as a woman in sports media, but also to understand that we need to create the narrative around women's sports. And it's a very exciting space because all of a sudden women's sports are growing, and this is not something actually that is all of a sudden. It's something that's had years of work of people starting to tell the stories of women's sports. And so people actually follow women's sports because of their stories, not because of their stats. And so I recently partnered with the Sports Innovation Lab, an innovation lab in Boston that does research about women's sports, and they told me it's the stories. It's not necessarily the stats that get fan engagement, that get new fans into women's sports. And so, as you said, the groups that are creating spaces for female broadcasters, that's awesome. But I want to go one step further and challenge them to say, okay, how can we creatively cover women's sports in a way that hasn't been done before? And I feel like it's through storytelling.
And you talk about stories, not stats, when, sports is a very stat-driven thing. It has always been, what is your 40-yard dash time? What's the mile per hour on a slap shot? I mean, what's your 3-point percentage? We could rattle off all of these different stats, but is that something that you kind of didn't expect when you really started looking at the difference between storytelling stats? Is that something that you thought about and it made sense, or were you expecting that when you first started hearing that phrase?
People told me when I moved here to start my job as a sports broadcaster, they told me to learn how to tell a story. And I asked them, I said, what do you mean? I know how to tell a story. I've been telling stories my whole life. But this is a different kind of story. And as you said, it's a story that might actually have some stats in it and might say, okay, this woman is the star player because, and then you can add the stats, but then look at her off the court, look at her off the field, and she's a whole person who's actually making a positive change in different ways that we can't see. So I think the stats are the opening portion. It's just the surface level of the story. And then we can go 2 or 3 levels deeper. I mean, you've done this wonderfully with your stories for the Breeze. You go 2 or 3 levels deeper and you look at the athlete as a whole person. And that is what I think the stats provide us an opening space to do, because we can look at a player that's standing out on the stats sheet, but we don't know who they are as a person. That's only their performance on the playing field.
Mm-hmm. And now, kind of changing a little bit directions here, I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit more about what some of the struggles are of being a woman in this industry. We've talked about what it's like trying to break through barriers, what it's like trying to get through the glass ceiling, find that next level, make yourself stand out, but at the same time, no change is made without some sort of drawback. And I was wondering, how have you managed to handle pushback? How have you managed to handle any sort of negative feedback, whether that's social media, whether that is misogynistic comments, whatever that may be? How have you kind of navigated that?
It's using your own values to get yourself through. So if someone says something, or you're in a space and you don't feel perhaps the most comfortable, using my own values and sticking to what makes me different, I just remember that, hey, that's a good thing, because you know the quote, you're no one unless you're talked about. So even if it's negative, it's still something. And that is what I do remember. I mean, hey, we're all human and those comments do hurt, but at the same time, it's a good space to be in, because it feels like we're pushing forward and change doesn't come without pushback. So being part of that change and being part of that next wave of female broadcasters is a privilege, because it does come with that pushback. But I guess it's not really about what people say, it's about how you feel about it and sticking to your values. And I feel like that's really gotten me through, because I do see myself as someone that looks at the emotions of everything, that tells the full story. And sometimes that full story isn't perfect, and people don't love sometimes the portrayal of someone who isn't perfect off the court, but that's okay, because that's what makes us all human. And so those are the stories that I want to tell regardless of what people think about that.
Yes, and something that has also really kind of changed a little bit is how women are handling the pushback. And, years ago when women were first starting to break these barriers, we would stay quiet. There wouldn't be a lot of comments. There would be female reporters during the first few years of working and going out, having access to locker rooms. They'd be sitting with their players' wives and girlfriends, fiancés, and not in the press box. And they wouldn't be able to say anything about it. But now women are starting to speak up. Women are starting to come forward, share their stories. How important is that for this younger generation to see women really starting to stand up, voice their grievances, and try and actively make change happen vocally and not just quietly?
It's so vital, because what it does is it sets the stage for the next woman to come up and do that. And so it's a chain reaction and a bit of a domino effect. And I can just point to one moment during my internship in college. I interned at WPRI Providence, Channel 12, and I covered the Patriots. I covered Tom Brady's last season as a Patriot. And it was me and my mentor, Ruthie Polinsky. She's now at NBC Chicago. Fantastic woman in sports to look up to as both a broadcaster and a person. But it was just her and I and a ton of men in the Patriots locker room. And there was a chance for me to ask some questions for the players. And so I went off as an intern, as a 16-year-old, and I started talking to the Patriots players. And I just asked them questions, and I did mock interviews with them. And that moment was very pivotal in my career, because it made me realize, okay, these athletes that I admire are right in front of me. Why not just open your mouth and say something and then make that connection? And they were lovely. And I saw Ruthie doing it, but if I didn't see her doing it, I'm not so sure that I would have had the confidence or bravery to go and do that. So it's really, even if there's just one other woman in the room, it's so vital.
Mm-hmm. And what would be some things that you would want to tell somebody? I know you and I have had multiple conversations throughout the past 2-3 years that you and I have kind of worked alongside each other. But, you know, if you were to talk to a high school freshman or even a college freshman that is interested in pursuing this field but doesn't know where to begin or doesn't know who to look up to, what would be something that you would want to tell them?
2 things. The first thing is, this is from Amy Poehler, who's, of course, from Parks and Rec, my idol, Leslie. This is another Leslie that I look up to. But she says, you talking about the thing is not doing the thing. Doing the thing is doing the thing. And that is actually what got me out of the house during the pandemic and here to Harrisonburg, Virginia, because I said to everyone, I really want to be a sports broadcaster, but that wasn't being the sports broadcaster. Mm-hmm. So if you want to be a broadcaster, you want to be a journalist, you want to be anything, I know it's a Nike saying to just do it, but it's not just that. I'm going to go one step further and say, flip your phone around, make it a video. Start recording yourself if you want to be on air. Start writing if you want to be doing print. So it doesn't have to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. It can just be for yourself, and those reps are so vital. Reps are everything. Reps are everything for me at this point in my career. Reps are everything for me in 5 years probably. It's all reps, it's all practice, just like tennis practice or just like field hockey practice. It's every single time that you go out there and do it. So the earlier you start, I mean, as I said, you can literally just start on your own phone. You can literally write in the notes app on your phone. You can start writing. And that will get you where you want to go because it's just one day at a time. And the second thing is you are your best advocate. So this has happened to me countless times. Somebody asks me what I want to do. You tell them what you want to do. You don't ask them back, what do you think I should do? And I was just talking to my mom about this last night. Shout out Mom, my best friend. Was just asking her what she thought I should do. And then I flipped it around and I said, you know what? I'm in control. I will tell you what I'm going to do. And it was actually that moment when she said, okay, yes, correct. Because we're seeing NFL players negotiate the biggest contract in the history of the NFL without an agent. We don't need an agent. We are our own agents.
Mm-hmm. And my last question for you, Perri. When you look at everything that's happened throughout these past 50 years of Title IX, I know that is something that you were really interested in throughout this past year, but I feel like we can't talk about female equity in sports without talking about Title IX. When you see that as a former college athlete, as a sports reporter, and you see the changes that have been made, what do you still think should be done at this point?
Opportunity. It's opportunity at every level of sports. So it's opportunity for the 5-year-old girl that wants to pick up a tennis racket. It's opportunity for the 10-year-old who wants to start competing. It's opportunity for the college athlete who might not know what she wants to do after sports. It's everything. It's really just creating more spaces for these women to step into these roles and just see if you like it. Because at the end of the day, I truly believe there's a path for everyone and they'll be able to find that, but I would love to see more opportunities for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Perri, thank you so much for coming. I know that you and I can talk for eons about this topic, and I'm so glad that you were able to come and sit down and join us for this episode.
I also just want to add one thing, that you are the future. And so thank you so much for all of your work. And thank you for being the other woman in the room with me for all of these years. These past 2 years that I've been here in Harrisonburg, it's been a pleasure. You've done a wonderful job.
Thank you so much.
So I'm really excited for your future.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the Change MakerZ podcast. Episodes are available every Sunday and Wednesday. And very soon we will be having our live show. So stay tuned for more information. And thank you so much for watching.